Our lecture today is Why Josephus Matters. So Josephus is a Jewish Roman author historian. He was active in the first century of the Common Era under the patronage of the emperors Vespasian and Titus. He authored two major and two minor works that have come down to us. So these are called The Jewish War, Antiquities of the Jews, a argument against Appian, and his autobiography. So I'm using these abbreviations here because these are kind of standard when for the quotations that we'll get later in there. So JW for Jewish War, AJ for Antiquity of the Jews, and so forth. Of these, the littler ones against Appian. Appian was a Hellenized, a Greek-speaking Egyptian who wrote a bunch of things about Egypt and Egyptian history, but was also an opponent of the large Jewish community in Egypt, especially focused in Alexandria, and he wrote in his works a lot of anti-Jewish writings, which Josephus counters. We don't have Appian's work, but we have Josephus's writing that he wrote against what Appian had written. And then we also have an autobiography, a brief autobiography of Josephus that tells us about him. So this copy of the Josephus here, this is the one edition that I had as a teenager at summer camp. So this is not a completely unusual book, I think. It's in lots of Christian libraries anyway. So for an 1,100-page, fairly dense ancient book, the text is frequently reprinted. And this is in part because there is a complete English text in the public domain. So a scholar named William Whiston translated all the text of all these works into English way back in 1737. And so publishers can take public domain texts and reprint them for free, and they don't have to pay authors or anything like that. And so then they tend to be cheaper. And the problem with relying on these is there would be better translations now. This one's going to be very out of date, even using kind of out of date English. And also, we need to have maybe more modern, up-to-date notations. Scholarship has moved on since 1737, but this is one of the reasons why it's broadly reprinted. But their text is also has a very broad appeal that comes down to kind of a single passage out of this 1,100-page book that Josephus did not write himself, or did not himself write, at least not in its present form. And so this little passage within this 1,100-page set of books is called the Testimonium Flavianum. And we'll look at that right now, just what that is. We've talked about that a few times before in our lectures on the historical Jesus and so forth. So this is coming from Antiquities of the Jews, and Josephus, or rather in the text it is written, in the text as we have it right now, it is written, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." So this is a very remarkable passage with, it's called a testimony here of Josephus. The idea that Josephus would have a testimony as a observant Jew, or a serious Jew anyway, who is testifying he is the Christ, he's the Messiah, and that he was resurrected and so forth. You would think that if you were, if you believed those things, and you were writing 1,100 pages in the English translation, in 1,100 pages of text, you might spend more than one paragraph on this topic. In other words, this might be interesting or important enough to give 20 or 30 pages at least, to it. And so it's clear that Josephus did not write this. He did not testify that Jesus was the Christ and had been resurrected and so forth. So what do we make of this passage? Is it simply an interpolation where it was inserted by some Christian at some point? All of the manuscripts that we have that survive of Josephus come to us through Christian copyists who have preserved them. It's all written from the manuscript tradition, ancient texts that have to be copied and copied over time to come down to us. And that's certainly one possibility. There's another possibility, though, that in fact there was a brief mention that Josephus has of this character who he didn't think was very important, and that has now been changed or edited by those Christian copyists. And so a lot of scholars have suggested that if we delete out these sections that I've marked in blue, that we will get close to, or we may get to, what in fact the original source had said. And so if we read it this way, we read, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds, and he was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to a cross, those who first came to love him did not cease, and the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." And so this is something that doesn't in any way, imply that that Josephus believed in Jesus as a Messiah or anything like that. He's a guy who had a following. It's not an important following. Josephus doesn't spend very much time on it. It's something that he just mentions kind of in passing, and there's no particular reason why he wouldn't have written something like this. And so that's certainly a possibility. It's the one that is persuasive to me. And how does this kind of thing happen? I've called this before essentially that the passage has been vandalized by Christians. In other words, there's been Christian copyists who have inserted things. But it doesn't have to have come about through some kind of malign conspiracy or even a deliberate defaming or vandalization of the text, because some manuscripts grow and change when you go through a tradition where you have to copy each individual text. So in a manuscript tradition, let's say if you had a book like this, you can see there's 2 columns as the original writing, and then you can see little tiny bits of text writing between the lines, and then you can see other text around it written into the margins. And you might make notes like that on your own books if you have school books or other books that you have been taking notes on as you're reading. And so we even have this phrase, reading between the lines, right? So in the manuscript tradition, scribes frequently wrote glosses, and so this could include corrections because each individual manuscript is hand-copied and they have errors in them, and so you sometimes, the thing that's written above the words is a correction, or if a word has been left out, or if it's an obscure word, he's using some Greek word or something that a lot of people don't know, and so then they might write a synonym for it, or let's say if the scholars are bilingual, they might write the word in Anglo-Saxon or something to explain what that word means, that kind of a thing. Or there could be an explanatory note for a difficult idea. And there can be, in some cases, like these marginal notes that contain additional information that the scribe who is reading in a pre-existing text thinks is interesting. And so we could have had each copy, as I say, has to be reproduced by hand. And sometimes a scribe would choose to take those notes that they are finding. If they're making a new copy, they get an old book that has all these notes. Sometimes they think, well, these are really good. And so they decide as they're copying it, instead of following the lines and making new notes, they just take the notes and insert them into the text, and that becomes the line. And so effectively when that happens, in the new manuscript, you really can't tell the difference between what was the original manuscript and what were the notes, because now the new copy, it's all simply the text. The text has effectively been expanded. And when we have enough manuscripts, we can tell in a manuscript tradition when that kind of thing happens, because then there will be like an entire family where it stays this way, or there's some particular change, and then all of them branch that way. And then you can tell when one of them inserts an error or a change or an addition, and then you can see all of the ones that were copied from that manuscript, and that creates another whole tree. And so if you have lots and lots of manuscripts, you can tell. Unfortunately, with the Testimonium here, this passage about Jesus, we don't have any uncorrupted versions. So all of our versions include the corruption. And so as a result, we can't tell, it's just a hypothesis that there was this uncorrupted version that has been corrupted. It's also possible that the entire thing was an insertion, which, in part doesn't really matter if that's the case, but that is also hypothetically possible too. I mean, both are possible. So let's show how this might have happened. So if this was the original, the way Josephus had written it, where he's just talking about Jesus as a guy who performs surprising deeds and is killed and created a tribe called the Christians that have not disappeared to the end of Josephus's time. So that if that was that original passage, then some Christian monk who is got a hold of this book, he might, want to write some exclamations. This is not saying enough about Jesus, right? And so he says there was a guy named Jesus, and you can see writing in the margins, if one indeed ought to call him a wise man, if one ought to call him a man, he's more than a man, He won over many Greeks, and this monk announces he was the Christ. And then they have to write an even longer testimony of their own. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, so teaching the resurrection. For the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. So it could have all kind of looked like that, an original text with these kind of writing between the lines and marginal notes. And then when the next scribe copies it all together, and that's how we would get that. Okay, so however the case is about that little passage, my suggestion is that Josephus is extremely important even without that passage. So even if we put that to the side, there's all kinds of importance for this text. In addition to that particular passage, there are two passages that I think everyone believes are authentic to Josephus that talk about the early Christian movement. So there is a passage or a story that Josephus has about John the Baptist, and there is also a story about James, the brother of Jesus, and his martyrdom, or not martyrdom for as far as Josephus is concerned, his assassination as far as Josephus is concerned. Anyway, because of those passages, but especially the one about Jesus, that has made the text obviously popular throughout the millennia with Christians, including popularly today. And Christians historically have also interpreted the Jewish defeat in the Jewish War, one of the major works of Josephus, as God's judgment. And so they have approved, and finally they've also approved Josephus' kind of program of converting the Hebrew Bible, making the Christian Old Testament by rewriting it and bringing it into line as if it were a Greek history book, which Josephus does, for example, in his book Antiquities of the Jews. So let me just look at how this sort of survival has worked. This is not entirely the manuscript tradition. This is also the translation tradition. So we have the 4 books here, the Jewish War, Antiquities of the Jews, the Contra Appian, and the Vita, or the autobiography. So the earliest one of these is the Jewish War, and Josephus anyway says that this was written originally in his own native language, and so we presume that means Aramaic, although it could mean Hebrew. If that is the case, that is a text that does not survive. And as scholars have looked at the Greek version that we have of that, the Greek version of the Jewish War, this does not look like, or it doesn't have any of the hallmarks of a translation from Aramaic into Greek. In other words, if you translate a book, it'll often have some of the original linguistic things that will kind of show up. It'll sound like, you translate something from German into English, it might sound like how an English person tries to do a German accent. In other words, we know some of these Germanisms or whatever that are the phrasings, in this case Hebrewisms or Semiticisms, that would be making it in. Most scholars think that the Jewish War looks like it's a fresh composition in Greek. He could have written the other book, but then he used it maybe as his notes and then wrote a brand new composition. In addition to that, then, the other books, Antiquities of the Jews, Contra Appian, his life story, we have Greek versions of all of those manuscripts, but they survive, again, only because they've been copied by Christians. The rabbis considered Josephus to be a traitor, and they've got really good reason for that, and so they did not copy his books. However, that doesn't mean that they didn't know of them, and so, in fact, in rabbinic sources, in the Talmud, and so forth, there are stories that parallel stories Josephus tells, and since Josephus is the main source for these, they probably are tacitly or silently using him as their source. In other words, there's some things that he tells, stories about like the siege at Masada and so forth, that are just too good to skip, even though he's a traitor and you don't want to use him, and so they rewrite it as if they had a different source. In addition to the Greek versions, in the 4th century, the books were translated into Latin, where they became very popular. So we have lots of manuscripts of all 4 books in Latin, or especially anyway the Jewish War and the Antiquities of the Jews. And it also had a 10th century Old Church Slavonic translation, at least for the Jewish Wars and the Antiquities. And interestingly, with the Jewish Wars, one of those kind of expansion and interpolation things happens where the Slavonic Josephus is actually almost a new text, because so much of additional stuff is kind of added into it by the writer who's adding that. And so anyway, that's an interesting, we had just a little while ago, we were just talking, with the last lecture we were talking about the Slavonic Enoch book, Second Enoch, and that book is, it's not originally written in Slavonic, but it survives in Slavonic because of this sort of medieval Bulgarian Empire and its successors. And so this is another example where Josephus was also picked up by them. So the only Hebrew version of this that we have, kind of interestingly, is in the 10th century, Italian Jewish guy from the Byzantine Empire in the 10th century, from kind of the area around Ravenna, made a paraphrase or a abridgment of Josephus and translated it into Hebrew, and that has come down to us as the Yosipon, but it turns out that it is actually based on the Latin version of Josephus. So we don't have any Hebrew, although some Jews in the West were still looking at the text. Okay, so the survival then of Josephus' work among Christians and not among Jews is actually very similar to what we've seen in the works of Philo of Alexandria. So Philo is a Hellenized Jewish philosopher from Alexandria who we had a previous lecture on. So these are among the most prolific first century Jewish authors whose works survive, and they're also writing pretty much exclusively in Greek. But in both cases, these are, and even though in both cases, neither one of these guys is Christian or very interested in Christianity, nevertheless, Christians end up being interested in their works in ways that people in rabbinic Judaism have not been up until more recently. They're much more interested, again, as we now are working on history, and everybody's interested in their own history and so forth. So as we saw in that Philo lecture, Philo was an extremely learned philosopher. He was among the leaders of a large Jewish community in Roman Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria was one of the biggest cities in the Roman Empire, the principal cultural seat of the Hellenistic world, and it had a massive Jewish diaspora community. That is a community that is living outside of Judea, the land around Jerusalem. And that diaspora community, the city itself, it may be the largest group of, like, urban grouping of Jews anywhere in the world at the time. So even though we think of, at this time anyway, the Jews as being focused around Jerusalem and so forth, and in some ways they were, in some ways the diaspora community was equally as important and maybe in some cases larger. So Philo, like many Jews in the Greek-speaking world, I mean, he knew a little Hebrew and he could use it, but he actually primarily accessed scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, through the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which had been made in Alexandria and was scripture for the diaspora Greek-speaking Jewish community in Alexandria and elsewhere. And Philo's work reinterpreted the Septuagint, the Hebrew Bible, through the prism of Greek philosophy in which he was trained. And so it's a very interesting piece where he, we've seen in the past where he was looking at essentially, Platonism, but also Stoicism, and looking and comparing Moses. Moses he's citing as a philosopher that would be, you could put up with the ancient great Greek sages like Thales and so forth. So Philo ended up being very influential on Christianity, but as I say, less so on Rabbinic Judaism. So let's just look at this conceptually a little bit. So both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism emerge out of the kind of broader religion of Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism was a diverse, partially Hellenized religion. So the Jews at the time of the temple's destruction in 70 CE had been exposed very directly to Greek ideas since Judea had been conquered 4 centuries earlier by Alexander the Great and then his successors. Nevertheless, the religion was focused on temple observance, and so animal sacrifices taking place in the temple, and focused on the priests and so forth that were in charge of those rituals and in Jerusalem. But nevertheless, it also included large diaspora communities that would contribute donations for the upkeep of the temple and so forth. So with the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, this was a major disconnect for everybody. So for teachers from the Pharisee sect of Second Temple Judaism, they emphasize law and observance, so Torah. That's central to them, and teaching from the Torah, teaching from law. This coalesces and becomes Rabbinic Judaism, which mostly, at least overtly, rejects Hellenism, while nevertheless having been influenced by many Greek ideas. In exile, ultimately, from Judea, the rabbis regroup. They attempt to excise Hellenism. They compile the Mishnah around the year 200, and later the Gemara around 500. This becomes the Talmud, and they use Aramaic with some Hebrew to do that. So in other words, rejecting this idea, like was happening in Alexandria, of writing in Greek and so forth. Meanwhile, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, what had begun as a Jewish sect of Jesus's followers, ultimately, though they separate out from being a sect of Judaism to being a separate religion, in part because the non-Christian Jews didn't like these messianic Jews, these Christian Jews, coming to the synagogue and talking about Christ all the time. It was not something they wanted to hear about anymore, and so they kicked them out. That was one of the reasons why there is a complete separation. So for the emerging then Christian religion, the Septuagint, the Greek version, that becomes scripture as the Old Testament. That becomes part of the canon. And over time, as Constantine's converted and later Christianity becomes the state empire of the Roman Empire, Christianity preserves kind of the Hellenized aspects of Judaism and continues to incorporate Greek thought. And meanwhile, when the empire converts, or the emperors convert, slowly over time beforehand, Gentiles, people who had been, Gentiles from the Jewish perspective, people had been Greeks and Romans who worshipped the old gods, who participated in the old religions, what's later called paganism, largely converted and formed the bulk of the population that became Christianity. And so that process expanded massively, like we said, after Constantine, and we're going to have a lecture on that. Meanwhile, there had been multiple Christianities within that, and one of the sects had continued to be a kind of Jewish Christianity where Christians who probably had roots going all the way back to Jesus' earliest followers had continued to believe that following Jewish law, at least it was as it was understood, maybe not the same way that the Pharisees did, but their own observance of it, that increasingly within Christianity, especially once the emperor takes over and starts to make it into a universal imperial institution, that becomes seen as a heresy and it's ultimately exterminated. So here's another way to conceptualize this more as a timeline. And so we have the timeline of mainline Judaism. We have the First Temple Judaism, which emerges sometime sort of before the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. At that point, the taking away of what becomes the lost 10 tribes, the continuation in the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, which has its rise and height and the beginnings of the biblical writings up until its destruction, the destruction of the First Temple in 586. And we have the period of the Babylonian captivity where the exiles are taken away to Babylon and other exiles move to Egypt to begin that Egyptian diaspora community. Then when the Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire, they're allowed to go back. And so 516 BCE, the temple is rebuilt. So that creates the Second Temple period up until 70 CE, 70 AD, when the Romans destroy the Second Temple. And so in that first period, there was primarily kings, the kings of Judah. There were also high priests, but it was centered on an actual kingdom. Throughout most of the Second Temple period, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem are politically under the control of other empires. So either the Persian Empire, Alexander's empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, the Seleucid Empire. There's a brief period when they have independence, and we just had a lecture on that, the Hasmonean period, the Maccabees, and then they're subject to Rome. And so that's that time period. And we can kind of see here, and then after the destruction anyway, we'll just stay on this mainline timeline, there's the regrouping of the rabbis, the composition of the Talmud, and that is the line that brings us to Rabbinic Judaism, all of modern Judaism. The second line here that I'm putting on, the Samaritans. So the Samaritans are people who stayed in the land when people were exiled, either fleeing to Egypt to form the beginning of the diaspora community there, or the elite that were taken away by the Babylonians who later came back. The Samaritans stayed in the land and continued to adhere to their own form of Israelite religion. And when the exiles came back, they declared that the Samaritans had intermarried with foreigners, and so therefore they did not want to have any part of them in helping them rebuild their temple and so forth. The Samaritans had their own temple in Samaria, just north of Judea, and they've maintained themselves separately to this day. There's a very tiny group that are left in Samaria in Palestine. I have on the next lines here the different sects, the three sects that Josephus identifies in Second Temple period Judaism: the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Pharisees. And we'll talk about those in kind of some detail in this lecture. And it is out of the Pharisee sect that the rabbis emerge and modern Judaism coalesces. At that very same time, there is also this Jesus movement, and it's out of that Jesus movement that Christianity emerges. And so this is another conceptual way to look at this overview. And I want to do one more of these so that we can think about the overall context of how Second Temple Judaism is working, the context that Josephus is in. So if we back up again, the Levant in general, the area of Judea and Samaria and Syria, Palestine, and so forth, all of that area is actually a lesser Syria. It was a greater Syria is a little north of that. This is a kind of small amount of fertile land or tiny land that is between two greater areas, Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so it is only when Egypt and Mesopotamia are in moments of chaos that this kind of little area can thrive and be at its height. Generally speaking, they're going to be dominated by one of the two major powers on either side of them, and often they are a borderland that is contested between the two. And so in the Iron Age, in the First Temple period, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah are wedged between, like I say, Mesopotamia and Egypt, and they are influenced by both. So the Assyrians and Babylonians are having power and influence over them. I mean, we've talked about how, for example, the stories of Noah and the antediluvian stories, that these have antecedents in the Sumerian myths. There's no particular reason for people in Judea to have a flood story, but it is a very obvious story to have if you're living in Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers that is constantly flooding and so forth. Likewise, Egypt is also always expressing all of these influences, and both of them are fit into the stories. So Abraham mythologically comes out of Mesopotamia, the land of Ur, of the Chaldees, and the Exodus story is the Israelites fleeing from the land of Egypt. So during the exile period, the destruction of the First Temple, the exiles are taken away to Babylon and are influenced there. It doesn't take more than a couple generations, and even the last princes of the house of David, they start to have Babylonian names in the Babylonian language and so forth, and so they are, and people then also are speaking thereafter, speaking Aramaic, and even modern Hebrew is written not in the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, the original Hebrew alphabet. It's written in a version of the Aramaic alphabet because of all of the influence. The religion adopts the 7-day calendar from these guys, and so in other words, there's all kinds of just massive influences that happen. The Egyptians also, this is where the beginning of this exile community. So at the same time that the captives are taken away, people like Jeremiah and a lot of the military, they flee to Egypt, and they even make their own temple at Elephantine in Egypt. During the Persian period, there's a lot of diaspora Jews that are still adding Egyptian influence, but the bigger period is from the Persians, Mesopotamian influence still, but also the Persian influence. This is when the exiles can come back and start building the Second Temple, but they do so as a poor province of the Persian Empire, and they're exposed to Zoroastrian or Mazdian ideas, for example, of things like cosmic dualism, the idea of a devil, the idea of a savior, the idea of a end of the world, an Armageddon, and the destruction of a world and a new world to be built after. All of these are probably ideas adopted from Zoroastrianism. Then Alexander conquers the Persian Empire. Now suddenly the tables turn. Now suddenly in the land Egyptian and now the broader Greek influence is from the West is more important, and that is Hellenizing. The Hasmoneans, we've seen the Maccabees there. There's still diaspora Jews in Babylon, and there is still influence even so. And this only increases in the period that we're talking about now, the very end of the Second Temple period, the Roman period. This is the period when Josephus is around. And so then Josephus is still around at the point when the Second Temple period ends. The Romans destroy the temple. And like I say, this is kind of the split that ultimately happens as the Hellenized component of Second Temple Judaism, or at least intellectually, goes with the Christians who canonize the Greek Old Testament and the Greek Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament and more or less embrace Hellenism. Whereas I think Rabbinic Judaism sees Christianity as a disaster and also maybe all of this focus on, this is what happens if you start letting Greek-speaking Gentiles into your synagogues. And so they focus again, instead of on Greek, on Aramaic and Hebrew, and studying scriptures in Hebrew and Aramaic. The Babylonian Talmud becomes the primary Talmud. And as I say, the rabbis are sort of critical of Hellenism, even if they have adopted some of these ideas. Okay, so that's kind of a framework that I've wanted to show to just give us a reason what the context is and also the survival of Josephus and influence. So let's return to who he was. So the first Jewish-Roman war fought between 66 and 73 CE, the Common Era AD. That resulted in the Second Temple's destruction. Like I say, that's pivotal for Judeo-Christianity and through each one of those religions as they separate. While there are brief accounts in other Roman histories, Josephus' writings really represent the war's only detail surviving narratives. In addition, Josephus serves as the major source for general history of first century Judea, which is a kind of a pivotal time, certainly pivotal for the emergence of Christianity, but actually also the emergence or the coalescing of the Pharisee movement and the rabbis. So some of the very earliest rabbis are operating in this time, but rabbinic writings themselves are only written down centuries later. So what do we know about him? For most ancient authors, very few details are known of their lives. So we've had a lot of texts that we've gone through. Sometimes we don't even know the name. And so sometimes all we can know has to be gleaned, kind of from the perspectives that they're sharing in their writings. So as they're making various value judgments, as they're leaving certain things out, as they're emphasizing certain things, or as they're maybe good at certain geography and they're bad at other things, we can kind of estimate that, well, maybe this person is from Syria, or maybe this person is from Alexandria, or something like that. Generally speaking, that's up to a lot of speculation. Josephus, by contrast, we actually have a lot of the information, but because this comes from his own biography, all we really have is what Josephus chooses to share, and like all his works, therefore, what we have has to be read with his personal partisanship in mind. So he wrote an autobiography in Greek around the year 99. So what does Josephus tell us? He says he is from a high-ranking priestly family on his father's side, and that his mother was a Hasmonean. So we just had this history of the Maccabees. This is the royal line that is of the briefly independent kingdom between the Hellenistic period and the Roman period in Judea. As a teenager, he was born in Jerusalem. As a teenager, he studied Jewish law, and then he tells us that he personally explored the major schools of Jewish thought, which he describes as the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And indeed, it's Josephus' other works that provide our primary description of these three sects. And I'll point out is that even though, because of Josephus, these three are the most famous, It doesn't mean that all of Jews were divided into these three, or that these were the only three sects. Josephus actually mentions plenty more sects than this. Usually they're smaller, like the Zealots or the Christians, for example, but he's seeing these as the ones that he feels anyway are the most important, but they still would only, the number of people that would have actually considered themselves a Sadducee, a Pharisee, or an Essene is actually pretty tiny out of the whole population in Second Temple Judaism who wouldn't have that kind of any kind of a school that they're associated with or sect. So according to Josephus, the Jews, this is about the Essenes, Sadducees, and Pharisees. The Jews, he says, had for a great while 3 sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves. The sect of the Essenes and the sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions was that of those called Pharisees. So let's look at each one of those as described by Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews. The doctrines of the Essenes is this, he says, that all things are best ascribed to God. They teach the immortality of souls and esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for. And when they send what they have dedicated to God and to the temple, they do not offer sacrifices, because they have more pure lustrations of their own. On account, they are excluded from the common court of the temple, but offer their sacrifices themselves. So, in other words, this group is out of communion with the group that is in charge of the Jerusalem temple. They consider themselves, the Essenes, to be more pure, and so they offer sacrifices themselves, which is forbidden in the law, to be doing, unless they have their own interpretation of why. So anyway, it also deserves our admiration, Josephus goes on to say, how much they exceed all other men that addict themselves to virtue, to such a degree that it has never appeared among any other men, neither Greeks nor barbarians, no, not for a little time, so hath it endured a long time while among them. So these guys are really doing a lot of hard work, and you've never seen it, and actually it's been going on a long time. And what is he talking about? This is demonstrated by that institution of theirs, which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common, so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who hath nothing at all. So this idea of then they have some kind of a communal organization, this sharing of property, and from what we know of communal experience, even in modern times, lots of people have this as an ideal, but it doesn't always last or go very well. And so Josephus is saying, look, these guys, they not only have been doing this very difficult ideal, but it's actually, they've been doing it for a long time. So that's pretty impressive. There are about 4,000 men that live this way, and they neither marry wives nor are desirous to keep servants, as thinking the latter tempts men to be unjust, and the former gives the handle to domestic quarrels. But as they live by themselves, they minister one to another. They also appoint certain stewards to receive the incomes of their revenues and of the fruits of the ground, such as are good men and priests, who are to get their corn and their food ready for them, and so forth. Now to the Pharisees, they live meanly. They despise delicacies in diet. So in other words, they're not Epicureans who were trying to eat, drink, and be merry or live rich. In other words, they are being modest in their diet. And they follow the contract of reason, and they do, and what that prescribes to them as good for them to do. And they think they ought to earnestly strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. They also pay a respect to such as are in years. So they appreciate people who are elders. Nor are they so bold as to contradict them, their elders, in anything which they have introduced. And when they determine that all things are done by fate, they do not take away the freedom from men as acting as they see fit. since their notion is that it hath pleased God to make a temperament, whereby what he wills is done, but so that the will of man can act virtuously or viciously. So they believe in free will. They're not fatalists. They acknowledge God's providence, but they are not fatalists. They also believe that souls have an immortal vigor in them, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishments, according as that have lived virtuously or viciously in this life, and the latter are to be tained in an everlasting prison, but the former shall have power to revive and live again. So they believe in resurrection, they believe in the immortality of souls, and so forth, on account of which doctrines they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people, and whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform them according to the direction the people do, insomuch that the cities give great attestations to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and their discourses also. So Josephus anyway says that these guys are pretty popular, all the things that they're doing among the common people. That brings us to the last of the groups. But the doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that souls die with the bodies, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them. So they focus only on Torah, not all of these other things. There's nothing in the Torah about immortality of the soul or resurrection or anything like that. Nothing in the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, and so they don't hold to that. For they think an instance of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent. But this doctrine is received but by a few, yet those still of the greatest dignity. But they are able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwillingly and by force sometimes obliged to be, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. So the idea here is, these are the elite guys. They are really rich. Sometimes they're forced to become public magistrates. This is not something you always want to do in the Roman Empire. It's actually very expensive to become a city magistrate and so forth, because it's your obligation, often out of your own wealth, to provide certain services or to give gifts to the people and this sort of a thing. And their ideas, what Josephus is saying here, are not popular. Nobody likes the idea that that there's no life after death and you die and that's it. That's continues to be an unpopular idea, although it may be very much more widely held now. So, in other words, just as a summary kind of what we're seeing and what we know from other sources, the Sadducees then are the sect of the hereditary nobility, the priestly caste, and the most elite priestly caste. They're interconnected with the Hasmoneans, that's royal house, who have been in charge of the high priesthood, but nevertheless they remain in Jerusalem as the priestly elite. They are conservative and are believing in a very literal interpretation of Torah, and they reject the idea that there is an oral Torah that Moses taught and other Pharisaic doctrines that allow essentially new ideas to make their way, things that were not in the Torah, like Zoroastrian ideas and so forth, to make their way into Judaism. They believe very strongly in free will and rejected the idea of punishment or rewards after death, because they actually reject resurrection and the immortality of the soul, since these are non-biblical. And they also reject the idea of angels and spirits, as they're very kind of fiercely monotheist. The Essenes are a sect, as we saw, that lives apart. They also claim, like the Sadducees, to be Zadokite, or in other words, descending from Zadok, the high priest under David, but they are apart from society, and that is why, as Josephus says, they're out of communion with the Sadducees, who control the temple. They attempt to live an extremely strict priestly and ascetic lifestyle according to purity laws, including everything like Josephus is saying, holding all things in common. So he finds them to be amazingly admirable, as you saw in his praise. These guys find the Pharisees and the different things that they're doing to obey the law to be very lax indeed. So Qumran, modern scholars believe, that is a center for Essenes, even though it doesn't match up entirely with what Josephus is saying, for example, about never marrying and so forth. So there are some married people and marriages that happen at Qumran, but Josephus he's not always accurate, and so he may also be making generalizations and so forth. Qumran, anyway, this is the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and where we, as a result, have a lot of the internal writings of what this community understood itself to be, if it indeed is the same as the Essenes, which most scholars, I think, believe. The Essenes are also apocalyptic and restorationist, so they believe that there will be multiple different kinds of saviors and end of the world and so forth. They believed in immortality, but they are very fatalistic in emphasizing that everything occurs according to God's will. They reject pleasure as the wrong kind of, pleasure is not the right way to find good. That's a low form of good. They live in strict communal life. It's very comparable to later Christian monasticism, especially the more ascetic versions of that. Again, they're apocalyptic. They believe that messiahs will eventually restore the pure practices to the temple, so the Sadducees will be eliminated and the Essenes will be able to take the pure lineage back and restore the temple. Finally, the Pharisees. So this is the scribal class. They're very learned in Torah interpretation. They have teachers who are, that's where the word rabbi comes from. And this later develops into the rabbinic movement. So they emphasized purity law, but they're nowhere near as extreme as the Essenes in their requirements. They definitely believe in something called an oral Torah, which is to say teachings that Moses is passing along within a scribal community, which have been passed along and so forth. So this becomes ultimately written many centuries later for the Talmud, which allows then for updates to interpretation of the Torah, bringing it up to date to the present day that the Pharisees were living. They had a nuanced view, as we kind of saw, about free will and the divine omnipotence divide. So this is a quote then from the later rabbinic Judaism, but supposedly dating back to a guy, Rabbi Akiva, who would be contemporary to Josephus here. He said, all is foreseen. In other words, God sees all, but freedom of choice is given. So there is free will, despite the fact that God is all-knowing and all-seeing. And we've had lectures on free will and determinism and this particular paradox or problem within it for people who are monotheists. So they believe in resurrection, eternal reward and punishment, spirits, angels, and so forth. So Josephus self-identifies as a Pharisee. So he describes an elite priestly background. So his dad is from a priestly family. His mother is a Hasmonean, a Maccabee princess. That would definitely put Josephus down as a family of Sadducees. So there would be a Sadducee family. But like I say, he says he explores as a teenager the various schools and even spends some time kind of living as a strict ascetic to kind of see how that goes. At age 19, he says he elected to become a Pharisee, which he says is kin to the sect of Stoics, as the Greeks call them. So Josephus' agenda here kind of shows through, and we'll see this again and again. So he's equating Jewish sects with schools of Greek philosophical thought, and he wants to align the Pharisees, which he was emphasizing how they do everything by reason and so forth. He wants to emphasize these with the Stoics, which in the Greco-Roman period become probably the most popular of the Greco-Roman moral philosophies. This is popularized and renowned from for example, the Meditations of the later Emperor Marcus Aurelius. These are this ideas that with the right kind of mental attitude, A prisoner can think himself an emperor, or an emperor can be like a prisoner, and it's depending on how you are you taking control of what you can control and letting go of the fatalist universe that you can't control, and so forth, is Stoicism. So Josephus is trying in his writings, again and again we'll see, to show his broader audience, the Roman audience especially, that Jews aren't these really weird, foreign, creepy, scary Persian people or something like that. You should kind of see them as being very similar to Greeks in the sense that they have all of their ancient, and they have all of these kind of ancient ideas, but the ancient ideas are really just like Greek philosophy and so forth. So after his childhood, in his 20s, Josephus joins a delegation from Judea to the court of the Emperor Nero. He's there along with a bunch of other leaders to help make a plea. Some Jewish priests have been taken into Roman custody, and he wants them to be released. This kind of a thing is something that you have to do all the time. So these are big delegations that get sent from the different provinces in order to influence. Initially, it was initially the Senate, but now in the era of the empire, the imperial court. And we also saw with our lecture on Philo of Alexandria that he led a delegation from Alexandria, delegation of Alexandrian Jews, to go to the court of Caligula, and so that was a thing that elites in the province were called to do. So Josephus returns from that trip to Rome, where I'm sure he made a bunch of contacts and so forth. He returns to Jerusalem in a time period which is the lead up to a Jewish revolt. Although he characterizes in his autobiography that he was constantly arguing against this revolt. He is doing that, by the way, in retrospect, having the rebels have lost the war. He switched sides in it, and he is now living in Rome as a client of the Roman emperor. So he's probably very disingenuous here when he's saying that that he was arguing against the revolt at the time, ahead of time, because he was actually appointed as one of the rebel military leaders for that region of Galilee, which is the region, Judea is where Jerusalem is, Samaria is north of that, and Galilee is the area north of Samaria. And so initially anyway, Josephus, regardless of what he says about himself, he's one of the rebel military leaders there. So after the Roman governor of Syria, so Syria is the kind of the big area that is just barely northeast of the area around Jerusalem. So Judea and Palestine and Philistia and Phoenicia and so on, all that region is sometimes even just called Lesser Syria. So it is the part of the Levant that is the smaller part of Syria, which we now think of as Greater Syria as Syria. Anyway, the Roman governor of that whole area with troops, the guy who had legions, was based in the northern part, in Syria proper. And after he tried to put the rebellion down and had a bunch of different losses, the emperor gave the command to one of his generals, a guy named Vespasian, who was sent to Judea with some 60,000 soldiers. So they're going to really just use the might of the Roman Empire. You don't get to rebel against the Roman Empire, is more or less what Nero says. So when Vespasian's troops reach Galilee and are winning a battle, many of the Jewish militants commit suicide rather than be captured. And after that happens at a particular siege, Josephus tells a story of himself being trapped in a cave with some 40 fellow partisans who all agreed together that they were going to have a collective suicide pact, and they'd carry it out by drawing lots. And so the way it works is they would draw lots, which you draw straws kind of thing. So essentially some person would, you'd get the straw to kill your fellow soldier, and then you then in turn, now that you've killed him, the next person is going to kill you, and then the next person will kill him, and so on, until they are all, the last person has to commit suicide only by himself. And so Josephus says that they got through 38 of those, all the way down the line, until it was just down to Josephus and one other soldier along with him. And the two of them decided, well, rather than go through this suicide pact, we're going to go ahead and surrender to the Romans. And so this actually, I hadn't known about this, but I guess this actually became, at different times or throughout history, because Josephus talks about this, a mathematical problem, which is called the Josephus problem. And I'm not going to do the math here, but essentially the idea of it is, if you're going to do this thing where you're drawing by lots, and it's how do you rig the system so that you and your one the one guy who's agreed with you that you're not going to do this thing, how do you make it so the other 38 guys kill each other first, and so forth, by drawing straws until it comes down to you. And so that's been studied by mathematicians. So I think right from the start, people don't believe that Josephus just by chance made it through this thing. And I don't think he even necessarily wants you to think that. The idea of it is that he's clever, right? So after he surrenders, Josephus is enslaved by the Romans, and the general Vespasian keeps him on, presumably as an interpreter. Meanwhile, the Jewish war is in full tilt. Nevertheless, there is civil unrest back in Rome. So Nero has not been a good or a popular emperor. There are all sorts of local rebellions that occur against him within the government, and that leads him to commit suicide. He is the last emperor of the original founding dynasty, the dynasty of Julius Caesar, which is called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, because it's the two families, the Julii and the Claudii, that are intermarried, that produce these original emperors. Now that they're gone, what's going to happen? And so this ends up being the year of the four emperors, 69 CE, where in turn, four different people try to assume the role of emperor in charge of the government: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and ultimately Vespasian, the guy who is the general here with all of the troops in Judea. So Josephus, while he's there, interprets Jewish prophecies of a Messiah. So this idea that Jewish scripture has, that there will be a Savior who's going to save the world and so forth, he interprets that himself to predict that that's Vespasian, and that Vespasian is going to be the Messiah, and he will ultimately become emperor. That's a very welcome news for Vespasian, and you can imagine, that's an interpretation that he liked the sound of. So Vespasian marches back to Rome and ultimately is victorious out of the different factions. So after Vespasian becomes emperor, he says, I liked that Josephus and what he was saying. I'm going to grant him his freedom. Josephus, then, the way freedmen do in the Roman tradition, he takes the name of the person who frees him. So the imperial name, he's named, the family name for Vespasian is Flavius, or Flavius, and so Josephus becomes Flavius Josephus. So Josephus then defects to the Romans. He's granted full Roman citizenship, and he then helps the emperor's son Titus, who has been left in charge of the remaining troops that are putting down the Jewish revolt, and they, together with Titus, with some help by Josephus in terms of advice, I'm sure, it proceeds to crush the Jewish revolt. And so after Titus' victory, Josephus moves with him back to Rome, where he becomes part of the court, and he is then engaged to write his histories under imperial patronage, first of Vespasian, and then later Titus also becomes emperor after his father. And so we'll just read here about just how the war ends. And this is Josephus on the Romans after they take Jerusalem. So they have had this long siege. They've been building up all this siege ramp and siege engines and everything like that. But by the time they get really close, the Jewish defenses collapse, they abandoned the walls and moved to the citadel and so forth. And so the Romans were able to burst through and take control of the place. And so now he says, since Titus's soldiers were already quite tired from killing men, and yet there appeared a vast multitude still alive, Caesar gave orders that they should kill none but those that were in arms. So anybody who was still a fighting person, if you were in arms and you opposed them, you should go ahead and kill them. But you should take the rest alive. But together with those they had orders to slay, they also slew the aged and the infirm. Why would that be? Well, we'll see. For those that were still in their flourishing age and who might be useful to them, they drove them together into the temple and shut them up within the walls of the court of women, over which Caesar set one of his freedmen, a guy named Fronto, one of his own friends, which last was to determine, one of his freedmen and also Fronto, one of his friends, which was the last to determine everyone's fate according to his merits. So this Fronto slew all of those who'd been seditious and robbers and who were impeached by one another. So if they all said, no, that guy did that, oh, that guy did that, well, those guys get killed. But of the young men, he chose the tallest and the most beautiful, and he reserved those for the triumph. So Titus is going to have a big victory parade where all of the captives are going to be paraded through the city of Rome, and everyone is going to be excited about all of the booty and everything that they've plundered from the temple and the city and everywhere else. And they're also going to have the tallest and most beautiful of the young men to march with them as captives. And as for the rest of the multitude that were about 17 years old, he put them into bonds and he sent them to the Egyptian mines. And so being a mine slave is pretty much the worst thing, and you don't have a very long life expectancy. Titus also sent a great number into the provinces as a present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theaters by the sword and by the wild beasts. So in other words, sent them out to all the different cities that they have Roman amphitheaters where they can have games and they're fed to the wild beasts. But those that were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. Now the number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000. And as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000, the greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation, that is to say, with the citizens of Jerusalem. So they're all Jews, but they're not belonging to the city itself. For they were come up from all the country to the feast of the unleavened bread, and they were on a sudden shut up by an army, which at the very first occasioned so great a straitness among them, that there came a pestilential destruction upon them, and soon afterwards such a famine as destroyed them more suddenly. So there's a whole bunch of civilians that have been gathered together, in part because they were visiting Jerusalem in the first place for one of these festivals, the Passover, well, the festival of the unleavened bread, and while they were shut up in there during the siege, they are also having a famine and pestilence and so forth. So 1,100,000, 1.1 million people, he says, are killed during the Roman siege. This is an ancient figure. Ancient historians are almost always wildly inflating numbers. They can't count that many. Modern demographers estimate that the whole population of the province was maybe 1 million, so there's not going to be 1.1 million just killed in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, even though he's exaggerating the numbers here, the devastation was clearly enormous. An amazing number of people were put to the sword. Some historians think that the 97,000 enslaved number may be pretty reasonable in terms of how many the Romans enslaved throughout the entire course of the war and so forth. And so we can see here the arch that's still in the Roman Forum that is erected, the Arch of Titus, to commemorate Titus's victory in the war. And we were talking about the slaves that are going to be paraded during that triumph. This is an important Roman military and religious festival that happens when they win a war. And so here they are, you can see the menorah in there and other implements from the destroyed temple, which are, along with all of those captives, being paraded through the city as the Romans cheer that. So considering all of these consequences, you can see why even though Josephus is a really important source for all of this, as he switched sides, helped in the destruction of all of this, and continued to live in Roman palaces, aiding the butchers here of this from the perspective of the Jewish people, why he's not looked upon that well from that community. So, like I said, that maybe illustrates why he's generally been seen as a traitor. Beyond, though, justifying his own roles, his writings are also colored by his strong agenda. So he does want, in terms of writing to the Jewish people himself, he wants the Jewish people to submit to Roman rule. This is something he sees, look, this is inevitable. There's no many times you're going to rebel is an empire with this kind of resources ever going to be able to be militarily overturned by such a small group. And if you just would learn to accept it, there could be potential benefits and so forth, I think is part of that agenda. And he also, too, writing to his broader Roman audience, he wanted to, like I say, portray the Jews as a people with ancient traditions that are kind of like how the Greeks have interesting ancient traditions that the Romans can accept, and they're not traditions that are scary and alien like the Persians or somebody that the Romans don't like. And so he would also like, even though there has been these conflicts, these rebellions, he would like to have a certain degree of assimilation so Jewish people can just be one of the peoples within a cosmopolitan Roman Empire. So those are sort of his strong agendas. So, assuring Romans about Jewish traditions. So we'll look at how he does that in his works. So throughout his works, especially Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus directly compares Jewish and Greek mytho-historical figures and Jewish and Greek customs. So he singles out Moses. So Moses obviously is believed by Jews at the time to have been the author of the Torah and is believed at the time to have been a historical person. And so Josephus cites him as a kind of a lawgiver, sort of like Solon, who is the lawgiver for the Athenians, who wrote the Athenian constitution or gave them a constitution. And so he says that Moses gave a constitution to the Jews, which is akin to that same kind of laws that the Athenians started out with. He also, for example, when he's describing the priestly equipment that Moses sets up in the wanderings, in all of the long parts of the Torah where it talks about all of the implements to have with the tabernacle and everything, he describes like the tables are very similar to the same tables that they have, that the pagan Greeks have at the Oracle of Delphi, which is a very important sacred center for the old religion of the Greeks. So Josephus casts Moses then in these kind of familiar roles, and that's very similar to how we saw Philo of Alexandria, who portrays Moses as a great Greek philosopher and indeed a precursor to the Greek philosophers. He sees in Moses' writings the same ideas that Plato and the Stoics have, and yet he's an earlier figure, so he's saying that this is even showing that the Jews had Greek philosophy before it was cool, kind of thing. So another example here, Josephus portrays King Solomon as a wise philosopher. So he writes in Antiquities of the Jews, now the sagacity and wisdom which God had bestowed on King Solomon was so great that he exceeded the ancients, insomuch that he was in no way inferior to the Egyptians, who are said to have been beyond all men in understanding. So even the Greeks always say that, well, the Egyptians had a much more ancient civilization and their wisdom. Everybody kind of knew that. That was actually true. But anyway, they all sort of knew that. But it's even evident, Josephus says, that their sagacity was very much inferior to King Solomon. So yeah, they may have been around for a long time, but he was wiser than them. Solomon, also composed books of odes and songs, 1,005. So he wrote all of these odes and psalms. He books of parables and similitudes, 3,000 of these. For he spake a parable on every sort of tree, from the hyssop to the cedar, and in like manner about beasts, about all sorts of living creatures, whether upon the earth or in the seas or in the air. For he was not unacquainted with any of their natures, nor omitted inquiries about them, but described them all like a philosopher, and demonstrated his exquisite knowledge of their several properties. So Solomon here is effectively an Aristotle, where he is going around and he is expounding on every kind of tree, all of the different living creatures and so forth, everything about their nature, and is actually doing inquiry about them in the sort of Aristotelian fashion, just like, very explicitly, like a philosopher. He talks about other sciences that Solomon had. God also enabled Solomon to learn that skill which expels demons, which is a science, useful and sanative to men. He composed such incantations also by which distempers are alleviated. So this is kind of a kind of medicinal idea of medicinal science. He left behind him the manner of using exorcisms by which they drive away demons so that they never return. And this method of cure is of great force unto this day, for I have seen a certain man of my own country, whose name was Eleazar, releasing people that were in a demoniacal, in the presence of Vespasian. So in other words, we've had a guy who was possessed by a demon. He was sitting there with Vespasian, and a guy from my own country, a guy named Eleazar, he did that. And his Vespasian's sons, his captains, and the whole multitude of soldiers. So in other words, we got a lot of witnesses on this thing. So it's not just, this is not just Jewish wives' tales here. We got the whole Roman army got to see this. The manner of the cure was this. He put a ring that had a foot of one of those sorts mentioned by Solomon to the nostrils of the demoniac, so the guy who was possessed, after which he drew out the demon through the guy's nostrils, and when the man fell down immediately, he adjured him to return no more, making still mention of Solomon and reciting the incantations which he composed. I command you, demon, to be gone in the name of Solomon, and so forth. And when Eleazar would persuade and demonstrate to the spectators that he had such a power, he set a little way off a cup or a basin full of water, and he commanded the demon, as he went out of the man, to overturn that basin of water. And thereby he let the spectacles know that it had left the man. So here the guy's got a whole show that he's able to do. You know that this incantation, casting out demons in the name of Solomon, it actually works because he's set up the bowl of water which overturns itself in the same way. Let's say when Jesus does it and they go into a bunch of pigs and the pigs run off the cliff and kill themselves. In other words, you know that the demon has actually come out because you see these results. And when this was done, the skill and wisdom of Solomon was shown very manifestly, for which reason it is that all men may know the vastness of Solomon's abilities and how he was beloved of God, and the extraordinary virtues of every kind with which this king was endowed may not be unknown to any people under the sun. For this reason, I say, it is that we have proceeded to speak so largely of these matters. So he spent a long time telling that story because it's important. So Josephus here, interestingly, I think, shows that exorcism was a pretty familiar practice to his day. And this passages like this, I think, give us an enormous amount of context for 1st century CE Judean culture. And obviously this is perspective that is only a few decades later than when Jesus is doing this kind of thing. And Jesus, as Josephus even says, is a worker of wondrous deeds. And then in Christian writings, include exorcism, so kind of healing that involves people believe that there are demons in, and that there are ways to cast demons out and relieve them. And so this is kind of an interesting context to this. It also really actually does tell us, which people don't actually realize as much, how much contemporary, he's telling these things, he's talking about this as a science, This is not totally, this wouldn't be totally alien to Greeks and Romans at the time. So philosophers are also doing, under the banner of philosophical science, their own kinds of things that we would look at as being more like magic. So there is a lot of medical science is similar to this, even in the Greek context. And so in one hand, he's showing kind of the context to his day in his own society, but in spelling it and saying this is pretty normal to a Greco-Roman audience, we're also seeing that this also is not something that they find strange in any way. So in the end, in addition to all of the value, and that's just one passage, there's all kinds of these, it's 1,100 pages of text that tell us all kinds of things about first century CE Judean life, the background and context for both the culture of Jesus and the early Christians, but also the earliest rabbis, as the Pharisee sect will eventually become the rabbinic movement. So his works, as long as we, again, keep his own bias in our mind, provide us then with a similar wealth of information for the proto-history of rabbinic Judaism. Josephus is one of the very few people, because the rabbis don't keep this name Pharisee and don't particularly cite the Pharisees as their predecessors. They cite different rabbis who were Pharisees who are their predecessors. But so as a result, because we don't have any writings of those that are contemporary, I think it may be that the only writings we have of people who actually say that they're Pharisees or describe themselves or self-identify as a Pharisee are actually Josephus and Paul. And by the time Paul's writing, he's left being a Pharisee. But in any event, it is very interesting because these Pharisees are also really important to the proto-history of rabbinic Judaism. So, in sum, Second Temple Judaism was really diverse. So as of 70, when the temple is destroyed, Judaism had been exposed to Hellenism, like I say, for 4 centuries, actually more than 4 centuries, but very pounded into them after the conquest by Alexander. There was all kinds of Greek contact centuries before that even. And it had already produced thinkers like Philo and Josephus, who wrote in Greek and attempted to find a synthesis between Judaism and Hellenism. And they were also both proponents of trying to get the Romans to tolerate and accept Jews within their cosmopolitan empire. And they both had successful delegations, or delegations that were relatively successful, to Rome in order to kind of spread that idea very directly to the imperial court, but they were trying that also within their writings. And we saw kind of the context and the results. So out of this diverse movement that is both Hellenized and then also Hellenized Jews and also Jews who were traditionalists, who were against any kind of Hellenization and so forth, Jews that were in the land, Jews that were in diaspora, both in places like Egypt and other cities in the Roman Empire, but also outside of the Roman Empire, in Mesopotamia, especially like Babylon. So the destruction of the temple and ultimately the rise and eventually huge gain of Christianity as a disaster in a way for Judaism. As Christianity canonizes the Septuagint or Greek version of the Hebrew Bible as Old Testament scripture and fully embraces Hellenism and even incorporates more Greek philosophy and so forth into Christian theology. There is a focus on Aramaic and Hebrew, the Babylonian Talmud and so forth, overt criticism of Hellenism and excising thinkers like Josephus and Philo, Hellenized, Greek-speaking Jews from the tradition as the rabbis regroup in the wake of all of this. And so we looked at essentially how that has created, these different strains in Judeo-Christianity. So all of which are coming out of Second Temple Judaism, except the Samaritans who are coming out of the time period. Well, they're a reaction against the Second Temple Judaism. earlier Israelite religion that is not included in the Second Temple Judaism, and then modern Judaisms, which all emerge out of Rabbinic Judaism, and modern Christianities that all emerge out of Nicene Christianity, the state religion of the Roman Empire, and ultimately, again, these sorts of ideas where essentially a quasi-Hellenized Judaism breaks into those two parts, the one especially preserving Hellenized Judaism in Christianity. And so that is my thoughts on why Josephus matters. So Leandro is going to gather questions from your comments in YouTube and Facebook. I want to thank you, Rain and Wednesday Jones, Tolkien Study, Bryce Pardo, J.R. Exner, Daryl Scott, Andrew Suriali, for your donations in the chat. Boy, that helps us keep going and producing these lectures. I really appreciate that. Luke McQuillian says, I believe Philo would have been alive around the same period as Josephus. Was there any contact between them and or influence on one another? So there is an overlap. Philo is an old man by the time then Josephus is a young man. Philo continues to be in Alexandria. Josephus at that time is in Jerusalem, so I don't think that there is any contact. There could be influence because it's completely possible. I have not actually looked this up, but it's completely possible that Josephus would have had Philo's books. So Philo would have written books, and so it's possible that that would have found their way to Josephus's library. I don't think they would have met, but I think that it's completely possible that Josephus had access to Philo. Rain asks, can you compare Josephus to Spinoza and how Rabbinic Judaism reacted to both? So, Spinoza is a Jew who is a modern philosopher who specifically sees nature as God, and so God as nature, and is intently trying to come up with a cosmology or a theology that is, I think, more about natural materialism. And so that this diverges too far from contemporary Rabbinic Judaism, that, this is kind of seen as a rejection, that he's outside of that. Josephus is existing before Rabbinic Judaism. He is viewed as, by I think most of his contemporary Jews, as a pretty big traitor for helping the Romans win this war and massacre all these people and enslave all of these people. And the rabbis continue to feel that way as Rabbinic Judaism develops. Nevertheless, he is the source for all kinds of interesting stories that, he is trying to promote Judaism in some ways as a very good thing, and he's very proud of it. And so he is a source of good stuff, and so some of his stories are retold by the rabbis differently, but they may still be taken from Josephus, but he's not credited with that. So Ravel, to expand, says, Josephus wrote that the land of Nod established weights and measures, transforming culture from innocence into craftiness and deceit, establishing property lines, and building a fortified city. What do you think he meant by that? So I'm presuming, and I have to think of where that is. I haven't read that, but I can just presume what this is this is an expansion. So most of the Antiquities of the Jews is taking the Hebrew Bible, and especially, actually the whole thing, but taking the Torah and the Deuteronomic history and the books of Kings and so forth, taking that period and taking it from the way it had been written, the way you could read it right now by reading the Bible, and instead converting that into a Greek-style history. And the Greeks had already been doing this with their own myths, right? And so they take Greek myths and they do this thing about making it more, let's say less supernatural stuff happening, although still sometimes some of it. Herodotus likes a good supernatural thing occasionally. But, let's say making it more rational and trying to kind of describe it more in social and other kinds of historical terms. So in other words, they're modernizing it for, into antiquity terms to what contemporary Greek historians would have had. And so in terms of this story that you're talking about, the land of Nod, essentially there is a very interesting passage that occurs in Genesis where we get a lineage from Cain. And so last week when we were doing and talking about Enoch, we were talking about the mainline lineage that goes from Adam through his son Seth down to Enoch and then eventually Noah and so forth. In other words, that's the main line of the lineage. But Cain, the son of Adam who slew Abel, also has a lineage in the book of Genesis. And what it says is that Cain's progeny are the first people that created a city. And so this is probably where, and one of the people in the lineage is a guy named Enoch, but it's a different Enoch, except for maybe it's not a different Enoch, because actually there's multiple sources that got put together to make Genesis. But anyway, in Genesis as we have it, it seems like a different one. And yet Cain's progeny are the ones that are involved in this civilization. And so when you're saying here, Josephus is explaining that, what he's kind of saying is that he's kind of establishing that we have these regrets when it comes to civilization. We miss the this idyllic life of living in paradise or something like that. And so he's taking this myth in Genesis and seeing this kind of obscure little passage, he's expanding that and suggesting that this is kind of the origin of the bad things in civilization. So J.R. Exner says, what, if anything, Jews who reject afterlife in paradise believe happens after death? So I think that the idea of it is, is essentially, the phrase that's in the Torah is that you are sleeping with your ancestors. So you're sleeping in the bosom of Abraham. So I think that they're seeing sleep as an analogy for death. And so either the answer is there's no experience at all, but if you need an analogy for it, you are sleeping or resting in the bosom of Abraham with your ancestors. And so that would be what would happen after death. Like I say, there is no nothing in Genesis where it promises it, at the end of the Ten Commandments, if you keep these commandments, then when you die, you'll get to go live in heaven. That's not in the text. Rain says, why was Philo of Alexandria, but Josephus does not say where he lived? So in some ways, this is somehow historians call these guys, right? And so in this case, sometimes Philo is also called Philo Judaicus, which is literally like Philo the Jew. And I don't think modern historians like to say Philo the Jew anymore when they're describing him, so we say Philo of Alexandria. And partly we say Philo of Alexandria because there's a lot of other Philos. But in terms of Josephus, there's nobody. So Josephus is the Latin for Joseph, right, or Yusuf. And so we know his name in Aramaic is Yusuf, or however the Aramaic version would that be, Yosef Ben, it's about father's name, so Matthias or Matityahu or whatever his father's name was. And so he is called Josephus as he's come through the Romans, and he's, anyway, one of the only Josephuses, so we don't have to put any more names. If we were going to do it, though, then we would call him Flavius Josephus, which he sometimes is called that, although he doesn't use that, but it's sometimes historians have put that on, ancient historians even have named him that because of the fact that he was freed by the emperor Flavius Vespasian. And in terms of where he lived, we could call him that, so he could be Josephus of Jerusalem, and that just would be where he's from, and just be a longer. If so, there were a bunch of Josephuses, we could call him Josephus of Jerusalem, more likely because that'd be really long, we'd call him Flavius Josephus. Tolkien said, he asks, how does Shakespeare know all this? Did he read Josephus? So he could have. This was well known, I guess. I'm not sure if it. So I know there's as we said, that there's a great English translation that is not too long after Shakespeare, but there was an earlier one too. So it's possible that this is in. Has been translated. Otherwise, it may be that there are extracts that were translated. So Josephus is that's a long translation to have made, so it may not be that the whole thing is in English, but there might have already been some of the most popular stories that were translated and made into an extract form by Shakespeare's day. Stephen asks, is there any credibility to the Flavius Josephus conspiracy, Caesar's Messiah? So there is a big modern conspiracy theory that the whole Jesus movement is a fiction that is made up by the imperial government, and that Josephus is behind that because he's a writer who was in the employment of the imperial government and therefore would be in position to do this. There is zero credibility to this. There is it's preposterous. There's no chance. Josephus wrote 1,100 pages, and if he was writing this thing, he would have spent, he was doing that. At the minimum, he would have spent 200 pages writing that kind of stuff. There's one little paragraph. There is no chance that any of this stuff goes back to Vespasian, Josephus, or his court, or anything like that. Christianity was not important in Josephus's day, which is why he barely mentions it. It was not relevant to the Roman government. They didn't care about any of this stuff. It doesn't become important for centuries. This is only a thing that has any, it seems like there's some kind of possibility of this in retrospect because of how important Christianity became centuries later. But there is we have so much historical evidence. We have so much from the time period. We know the development of what's going on in Rome. Otherwise, this is not, there's no credibility to it. Daryl Scott says, would major Jewish philosophers like Maimonides have known and been influenced by Josephus? So I think I have read that Maimonides did have Josephus, and so in some cases they would have access to those, especially in the West. So Maimonides is in Spain and later I think in Egypt, but he would have potentially had access to these texts because he is in a mixed community where there's Muslims and Christians and Jews, and so even if I'm trying to think of what the language he would be accessing it. So Maimonides, I don't know what all of his languages are, and I don't think that there is I'm not sure that there's a Hebrew translation of this, but presumably, I mean, he will know Greek, I guess, and so he could read it in Greek. So yes, I think it's completely possible for Jewish philosophers and maybe even Maimonides to have been influenced by it, but I haven't looked at it in particular. Genghis Khan says, Josephus mentions distinction between the groups on the immortality of the soul. Is there any indication whether any Second Temple Jews agreed on the pre-existence of a soul posited by Neoplatonists? So that's more difficult, and so I think that it's less clear that that everybody agreed or didn't agree. In fact, it's even harder to pin down early Christians even on the idea of pre-existence of souls. There's a pre-existence for Christians. Ultimately, there's a pre-existence of Jesus, since Jesus is God. So there's the idea that the second person of the Trinity exists before incarnation. But I'm trying to think if I don't think that there necessarily is a lot of, I don't know that we have a lot of that. So there might have been individual writers, but I don't know that we have, it's certainly not a hot button topic for Josephus, so he hasn't gone through and put that as part of his grid. Oh, do they believe in pre-existence of souls? No, 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 or yes, yes, yes. I think it's not on his list. So it's probably only later when, so some of these immortality ideas are being infused into Judaism by initially from Zoroastrianism. And so that's why they're more focused on resurrection, which is a Zoroastrian idea, as opposed to the Greek idea of the spirit that is immortal and that is pre-existent, coming into the body and existing outside of the body again. So later in the Hellenism, the Christians and everybody really kind of go that way more because of the Greek idea of spirit, I think, is much more important in the Hellenism component of it. And it may well be that that's where, I don't know exactly where rabbinic Jews are right now on that, but I think that, like you say, it's influencing certainly Christians later from ideas like Neoplatonism, and this earlier time period. It's not, I think, part of. I don't think it's part of Zoroastrianism, and so I therefore think it's probably not there. J.R. Exner says, a new Cleopatra movie just came out with a Black American as Cleopatra. What is your view of the idea of Alexandria as a depository of African knowledge that Greeks stole? Oh, Leandro's going to give me the question here in a second here. What's going on here? Did you? Okay. So just up to that point, I don't need the rest. What I just said was okay.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go again.
So anyway, Leandro's trying to just get the end part off, and then you can come back with that as a follow-up. So we're talking about this idea of Africa, this kind of thesis that it's been popularized in like academic books from the 70s, Black Athena and so forth. This idea, so Alexandria and Egypt are on the continent of Africa, what we now call Africa. So the word Africa actually is originally the Punic word for what we now think of as Tunisia. So the Romans called that continent Africa because the Romans were really worried about Carthage and had Carthage as their rival, and so they then started calling that whole landmass Africa. The Greeks, I think, tended to call that Libya, and then they called the southern part of it Ethiopia and so forth. Because there are multiple, so through the time period where in modern times there was a modern and false pseudoscientific racial identification where people were divided into Caucasian, we say, African, Native American, and East Asian races, right? And so there's actually more, so on the one hand, the sort of racial distinctions we find are not as genetically real as all of that. And also the reality is that because the human species, the modern Homo sapiens, came out of Africa, there are actually more significant divisions between different Africans, South Africans, and so forth than maybe are some of the other differences of the people who migrated out. So what I'm going to say here is that it is not a black and white issue where, because of the landmass of Africa, the people in Egypt are African and the people in Eurasia are white or whatever. That's not. This is kind of in a way, a false dichotomy out of the 19th century and early 20th century racial pseudoscience, of which this idea, Alexandria as a depository of African knowledge that the Greeks stole, is a reaction against that original false idea. And it's good to have a reaction because the original idea was false. Unfortunately, it is a significant overreach that is not based on actual evidence. The Cleopatra is she's of Macedonian Greek descent, not sub-Saharan African descent. The Alexandria is an alien in some ways. It does have lots of Egyptian influence, but the Egyptian people themselves are an intermediary people in the same way that the Jewish people are an intermediary people. So in other words, the Middle Eastern people are Jewish people and the Egyptian people are in some ways more related to each other because they're right next to each other in the spectrum that exists. And so when we had this book about that Josephus wrote against Appian. Well, Appian is of Egyptian descent, and he's a fully Hellenized Egyptian who lives in Alexandria. So there are Egyptians too, but a lot of the elite in the Hellenistic world, Alexander and his troops are Macedonians, which is to say northern peoples that have been Hellenized, and northern Balkan, or southern Balkan, but northern Greek peoples. And so they would be ethnically very different from, or racially very different from sub-Saharan African peoples. And the depository of knowledge, it's a center that is based on the classical Greek tradition. Are they also influenced by it? I've shown in these things about how there's influences wherever you're at. You're getting influences from that. So there is definitely influences from this ancient culture of Egypt. And Egypt is next to Nubia, which they're influencing and getting influenced by, and so forth. But what my position on this is overreach, and it doesn't reflect what Cleopatra would look like any more than Elizabeth Taylor, who is, I don't know what she is, a Midwestern U.S. person probably. So, Darthorama. Would you say Josephus was a bit of a first century con artist playing both sides? So he's an opportunist in a way, I would say, it seems like. I don't know what you're going to do. In terms of when he's writing his own autobiography, and he doesn't want to admit that he's a rebel. so he wants to say that, I don't know, it is, I don't believe him when he's writing those components of it. So yeah, I guess in some sense he's, I feel like he's just trying to deceive me as a reader. But that said, in terms of playing both sides, he was a young guy. So when he's in charge of this of Galilee military, he's like 26 or 27, and he may have been inspired by some patriotism. He wanted his people to be free and throw off the yoke of the Roman oppressor or something like that. And yet then when the Romans sent 70,000, 60,000 troops in and massacre everybody, well, at a certain point you're like, okay, plan B, this isn't going to work, so it may also have been a realism at a certain way. Nevertheless, it's his even his description of getting out of the suicide pact is very self-serving, right? So you can't, he ends up living his life out in a palace and being able to just devote himself to his study and writing, and all of his friends either committed suicide, got massacred, or got sold into slavery and had to work in the mines of Egypt. So, for a very short lifetime at that point. So you can't, in that sense, you can't look on him too highly as, oh, you're like the most noble man we've ever met or something like that. Michelangelo says, does the fact that we have only commented, or I was contaminated copies of his work mean that at one point only one copy existed? At some point, was the work at risk of being lost, or was it always popular? Yeah. So yeah, that must be the case. And so I have to look at that does sound like it. So maybe at some point or other it did go through that ringer of where, that seems strange to me though. So maybe it is that there are ones that, that's a good question, because I want to find out if there is, I don't think we have ones that don't have it though. So I think that it must have been contaminated very early. So it's interesting. I need to look that up. That's interesting and a very important point. Andrew Suriali says, there is supposedly a second version of the Testimonium in another language where the editions are different from our standard version. Do you know of this? So I think that might be the Slavonic one, the old church Slavonic one, where I was saying that is like translated into, the liturgical language, Old Bulgarian, the Bulgarian Empire, and the thing is much expanded. So the entire book is wildly expanded, and so I think that there are additional expansions there, especially. And so that may be what you're thinking of or talking about. If there's another one, I'd like to hear about it. The Chronicles of Lucifer says, Josephus was a writer by trade. What other trades or industries were prevalent in the 1st, 2nd century that would have helped spread rabbinical beliefs? Well, I mean, so pretty much, the number one trade in all of this time period is agriculture. So everybody is involved in agriculture in terms of like a dominant trade. And then beyond that, there are, the kind of small time industries and crafts that are essential for subsistence farming. So you'll have people, like Jesus was a woodsmith, right? And so essentially the person who's making that, or barrel makers and all of those kinds of industries. So all of those kinds of ancient crafts and so forth. In terms of spreading, though, beliefs, including rabbinical beliefs, well, the rabbis are teachers. So what spreads their beliefs are the profession of teaching and also the profession of being a scribe. And it's because their beliefs are focused on study of books. That is a very, if your profession is scribe and teacher, that also you could say is maybe self-serving. Now our religion is now going to be focused on reading, writing, and teaching, say the teachers, the rabbis, right? And so, so I think that's the trade or profession anyway that spread the belief. Fernando Garrido says, can you explain Stoicism via Moses, the Greek Stoics and the Pharisees again? So what I'm saying is that that Josephus argues, or says just outright that he joined the Pharisees, that the Pharisee sect, and he uses the word school, this is a school that is akin to the Greek school of the Stoics. And so what I was just saying, so he described what he said the Pharisees were all like. In other words, they're rational. They have a belief in an afterlife and punishment or not. They believe in free will, but they believe that lots of things, they believe in a nuanced kind of free will where people are able to choose between kind of good and bad for their little things that are within their control, but that God has a overarching providence over everything else. So in other words, as opposed to the Essenes, who are just fatalists, God determines everything, they are maintaining this little space of free will for you to do the things in your own little life that are not going to have like this butterfly effect and affect everything, because God has a plan for everything else. And so this is akin to Stoicism in the sense that the Stoics are determinists. They think that essentially the world is set in place and the world spirit is all governing it and it's all going forward. But you have a free will to do with it what you want. So for example, if you are a Stoic and you get to be captured by the Romans and put into a prison, if you think of that prison as you being able to be away from all of your annoying friends and not having to do all these particular chores, and you have a roof over your head or whatever, if you a place to think and ponder your philosophy and all those kind of things, you might actually be able to make that prison a paradise for yourself because your own expectations and your mind make it so. Whereas if you, let's say, were the king, but you're constantly worried that you're about to be assassinated or you're being worked to death because you have these responsibilities and it's driving you crazy and all those kind of things, you're a prisoner of your responsibilities because of your mental attitude. So in other words, you as a Stoic have control over that, even though you can't control the rest of the universe. And so I think that is the equation that Philo is making between kind of Pharisee general beliefs and the actual Greek philosophy of Stoicism. All right, guys, that is the end of our questions. Thank you so much for being with us. We want you to save the date for our upcoming lectures. We are taking a break next week. I'm going to go to BC. That's my cousin's wedding, and I'm going to get to officiate at the wedding, and I'm really looking forward to it. The following Tuesday, on June 27th, we're going to talk about Constantine and how that changed history. And then on the 4th of July, we are talking about Why was Jesus from Galilee? Thank you so much.